Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, an unrehearsed panel discussion of the U.S. government's wars and the racism they inspire. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, May 10th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television in Urbana, Illinois. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. The name AWARE stands for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. AWARE is part of the national and international anti-war movement against the wars waged by the Bush and Obama administrations, unfortunately in a consistent U.S. tradition. U.S. presidents have killed, wounded, or made homeless well over 20 million human beings, mostly civilians, since the 1960s, far more than any other government in the world. Today, President Obama says he's fighting terrorism in the Mideast, but the real reason is what it's been for a long time: control of the region's energy resources. The U.S. doesn't need oil from the Mideast, but Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia. And so control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. That control benefits only the American economic elite, the 1%, and not Americans in general, who've seen wealth concentrate in fewer and fewer hands at an accelerating rate over more than a generation, in a general economic and political program that has been called neoliberalism. The neoliberal programs of the past generation in both U.S. political parties have concentrated wealth and power in far fewer hands while undermining functioning democracy. But those programs have aroused opposition as well in the U.S. and abroad. In Europe, mainstream parties have been rapidly losing members to left and to right. There is a mood of angry impotence as the real power to shape events largely shifted from national political leaders, who in principle at least are subject to democratic politics, to the market, the institutions of the European Union and corporations, quite in accord with neoliberal doctrine. Very similar processes are underway in the United States, for once somewhat similar reasons, a matter of significance and concern not just for the country, but because of U.S. power for the world. The rising opposition to the neoliberal assault highlights another crucial aspect of the Standard Convention. It sets aside the public, which often fails to accept the role of spectators rather than participants, assigned to it by liberal democratic theory. Such disobedience, we see it in the Trump and Sanders campaigns right now, I think, such disobedience has always been of concern to the dominant classes. Just keeping to American history, George Washington regarded the common people who formed the militias that he was to command as, quote, an exceedingly dirty and nasty people, evincing an unaccountable kind of stupidity in the lower class of these people, close quote. George Washington was so anxious to sideline the fighters he despised that he came close to losing the revolution. Indeed, he might actually have done so had France not massively intervened and saved the revolution, which until then had been won by guerrillas, whom we would now call terrorists, while Washington's British-style army was defeated time after time and almost lost the war. A common feature of successful insurgencies like what we call the American Revolution, is that once popular support dissolves after victory, the leadership suppresses the, quote, dirty and nasty people, close quote, who actually won the war with guerrilla tactics and terror for fear that they may challenge class privilege. The elite's contempt for the lower classes of these people has taken various forms throughout the years. In recent times, one expression of this contempt is the call for passivity and obedience, we call it moderation in democracy, by American politicians reacting to the dangerous democratizing effects of the popular movements of the 1960s. For example, global opposition to the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 was overwhelming. Support for Washington's war plans scarcely reached 10%, almost anywhere in the world, according to international polls. Opposition sparked huge worldwide protests, in the United States as well, probably the first time in history that imperial aggression was strongly protested even before it was officially launched. The front page of the New York Times reported, quote, "There may still be two superpowers on the planet, the United States and world public opinion." Unprecedented protest in the United States was a manifestation of the opposition to aggression that began decades earlier in the condemnation of the U.S. war in Vietnam, reaching a scale that was substantial and influential, even if far too late. The anti-war movement of the 1960s and 70s did become a force that could not be ignored. Nor could it be ignored when Ronald Reagan came into office in the 1980s, determined to launch an assault on Central America. His administration mimicked closely the steps John F. Kennedy had taken 20 years earlier in launching the war against South Vietnam, but they had to back off, the Reaganites did, because of the kind of vigorous public protest that had been lacking in the early 1960s. The assault was awful enough, the victims have yet to recover, but what happened to South Vietnam and later all of Indochina, where the second superpower, that is the anti-war movement, imposed its impediments only much later in the conflict, was incomparably worse. It's often argued that the enormous public opposition to the invasion of Iraq had no effect. That seems incorrect. Again, the invasion was horrifying enough, and its aftermath is utterly grotesque. Nevertheless, it could have been far worse. Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and the rest of Bush's top officials could never even contemplate the sort of measures that President Kennedy and President Johnson adopted 40 years earlier, largely without protest, like carpet bombing poor populations. We here at Aware on the Air also want to consider China's rise to power and its challenge to the United States and the overall framework of order, as Henry Kissinger said, as well as the new Cold War simmering in Eastern Europe, the global war on terror, American hegemony and American decline, and a range of similar considerations. Ever since the end of the Cold War in 1991, the overwhelming power of the U.S. military has been the central fact of international politics. This is particularly crucial in three regions: East Asia, where the U.S. Navy has become used to treating the Pacific as an American lake; Europe, where the United States, which accounts for a staggering 3/4 of NATO's military spending; and the Middle East, with its giant U.S. naval and air bases, as Ron Zook has described on this program. And as Karen Arama has described here, Chinese leaders understand very well that their country's maritime trade routes are ringed with hostile powers, from Japan through the Malacca Straits and beyond, backed by overwhelming U.S. military force. Accordingly, China is proceeding to expand westward with extensive investments and careful moves towards integration. In part, these developments are within the framework of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes the Central Asian states and Russia, and soon India and Pakistan, with Iran one of the observers. The United States was called on to close all military bases in the region. China is constructing a modernized version of the old Silk Roads, with the intent not only of integrating the region under Chinese influence, but also of reaching Europe and the Middle Eastern oil-producing regions. It's pouring huge sums into creating an integrated Asian energy and commercial system with extensive high-speed rail lines and pipelines. The U.S. is largely responsible for the 9 wars now going on between North Pakistan and Northwest Nigeria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Southwest Turkey, Yemen, Libya, South Sudan, Northeast Nigeria, and Somalia. And this is in opposition to the expansion of Eurasia, China and Russia. 40 years ago, the U.S. government withdrew from an illegal war because Americans demanded it. By the late 1960s, polls showed that 70% of Americans regarded the war in Vietnam as not a mistake, but as fundamentally wrong and immoral. We must begin to see today's American wars as fundamentally wrong and immoral. We must demand that President Obama and his successor, probably Clinton, 1, end the drone assassinations; 2, bring all U.S. troops and weapons home; 3, close the 1,000 foreign U.S. bases around the world, No other country has more than 12. 4, end the provocations of Russia and East Europe and China and the South China Sea. 5, end support for Israel's apartheid policy and stop sending them money and weapons. And 6, support negotiations among the U.S., Russia, and their clients to end the Syrian and Iraqi civil wars. In a book on the last presidential campaign, President Obama is quoted as follows: "Turns out I'm really good at killing people," Obama said quietly. "Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine." However ironically he meant it, the quote has not been denied by the White House, and it turns out to be true. President Obama has attacked 8 countries. George Bush only attacked 6. His drone assassinations, for which he chooses the targets, have killed thousands of people, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children. And his special forces are active today in no less than 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you won't hear much about it in the American media. We'll mention some of it tonight, beginning with Ron Zook.
Yes, I have a number of topics to cover. Necessarily, the remarks will be very brief and relatively superficial, but some interesting material has appeared in the steadfast liberal publication, the New York Times. On April 27th, article by Jennifer Daskal, "Obama's last chance to end the forever war." The United States is fighting an unauthorized war, she says. Over the past 19 months, American forces have launched more than 8,800 strikes against the Islamic State in Iran and in Syria and hit the group's affiliate in Libya. The United States continues aerial assaults against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, in Yemen, is going after militants in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and killed more than 150 suspected Shabab fighters in Somalia just last month. So there's this ongoing attempt to provide some kind of legal fig leaf to these endless wars and ever-spreading wars in the Middle East and elsewhere. And the rationale for this is becoming increasingly tenuous, threadbare, thrice attenuated, and so on in the eyes of most people. The primary legal authority, this article says, for these strikes and deployments comes from the 60-word authorization for the use of military force, the AUMF, passed almost a decade and a half ago, in the days after September 11th, 2001. President George Bush asked for an open-ended authorization to fight all future acts of terrorism without limitation of place and time, and so on. Wisely, Congress rejected the request, although it did give the president authority to use force against those responsible for the September 11th attacks, al-Qaeda and those that harbored them, the Taliban. Today, the Taliban no longer rules Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden has been killed, and other key participants in the September 11th attacks are either locked up or dead, but the old authorization lives on, curiously. Next article, New York Times. Today, the editorial says, "A soldier's challenge to the president." Captain Nathan Michael Smith, 28, is helping wage war on the Islamic State as an Army intelligence officer deployed in Kuwait. He is no conscientious objector, yet he sued President Obama last week, making a persuasive case that the military campaign is illegal unless Congress explicitly authorizes it. So once again, there's been no declaration of war, and then technically no war by the United States since, I think it's 1941. So it's really amazing that there would be such a vague attempt, infinitely elastic apparently, to cover all American military action and war making since then. quoting, when President Obama ordered airstrikes in Iraq in August 2014 and Syria in September 2014, I was ready for action, he wrote in a statement attached to the lawsuit. In my opinion, the operation is justified both militarily and morally. But as his suit makes clear, that does not make him legal. Constitutional experts and some members of Congress have also challenged the Obama administration's thin legal rationale for using military force in Iraq and Syria. The Federal District Court for the District of Columbia should allow the suit to move forward to force the White House and Congress to confront an important question both have irresponsibly skirted. The 1973 War Powers Resolution requires that the President obtain specific statutory authorization soon after sending troops to war. Mr. Obama's war against the Islamic State, also known as ISIS or ISIL, was billed as a short-term humanitarian intervention when it began in August of 2014, and so on and on. So all of this has been rendered more or less meaningless or unavailing by subsequent events. And the administration is still trying to use this brief and vague statement about the use of military force as the rationale for the indefinitely extended and ever more destructive and murderous war in the Middle East. Next point, U.S. destroyers sails near disputed Chinese island. In CNN, the U.S. Navy on Tuesday sent a guided missile destroyer within 12 miles of a disputed island in the South China Sea, where China has built an airstrip, promoting China to scramble fighter jets and dispatch warships to expel the American ship. Quoting, the USS William P. Lawrence exercised the right of innocent passage while transiting inside 12 nautical miles of Fiery Cross Reef, a high tide feature that is occupied by China, but also claimed by the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam, a Pentagon statement says. This operation challenged attempts by China, Taiwan, and Vietnam to restrict navigation rights around the features they claim. Notice that's not just China, it's also Taiwan and Vietnam who are complaining about this. The features that they claim, contrary to international law, the statement continued. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, 12 nautical miles is considered the limit at which a nation's rule extends off its shores. This is amusing because, according to my information, the United States has not subscribed to the Convention on the Law of the Sea. So we're complaining about them violating it, although we've never authorized it or validated it in our own case. Next point, Obama to be the first sitting president to visit Hiroshima. President Obama will become the first sitting American president to visit Hiroshima, Japan. The White House announced on Tuesday, making a fraught stop this month at the site where the U.S. used an atomic bomb at the end of World War II. The visit, hotly debated in the White House for months, as the president planned his coming trip to Vietnam and Japan, carries weighty symbolism for Mr. Obama, who is loath to be seen as apologizing for that chapter in American history. It was previously announced that when Secretary Kerry went there, there would be no apology for the use of the atomic bomb, which in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, initial use of which is said to have killed about 100,000 people very quickly. But we're not apologizing for that. Indeed, Obama has been attacked over and over again for his European tour several years ago, claiming that it was an apology tour, and the USA never apologizes for anything as we continue to bomb, destroy, kill, and so on. Next point, U.S. Defense Chief, NATO ponders ground force in the Baltics. Stuttgart, Germany, the NATO alliance is considering establishing a rotational ground force in the Baltic states and possibly Poland, reflecting deepening worry about Russian military assertiveness. the U.S. Defense Secretary Ash Carter said Monday. So this is one of the ideas under discussion, Carter told reporters. The Allies are considering a rotational ground force of 4 battalions, which would mean about 4,000 troops. That would be in addition to and separate from a recently announced unilateral U.S. decision to send U.S. Armored Brigade of about 4,200 troops to Eastern Europe next February. So in reply then, Wall Street Journal, May 4th, Russia says it is creating 3 new divisions to counter NATO moves. Russian officials said that the alliance will send about 4,000 troops to Poland and the Baltics. So Moscow comes back saying that they're going to create 3 new divisions to counter the NATO organization's planned expansion along its eastern flank. Quoting, the defense ministry is taking a series of measures to counter the expansion of NATO forces in direct proximity to the Russian border. The Soviet official said at a ministry meeting shown on state television. The Pentagon has said that new NATO troops deployments are a response to Russia's provocative, quote unquote, military exercises along its borders with the alliance members. Russia says its exercises are partly a result of the increased NATO presence. So there they go, blaming each other. The arms race goes on. The U.S. And NATO putting more and more armaments and troops on the border of Russia. Russia saying you're provoking us, and we're going to have to increase the number of troops and tanks facing those NATO forces on the other side of the line, and so it goes. The arms race continues. Final point, Congress to the Air Force. You can't retire the A-10, the Warthog airplane, until the F-35 proves it's better. The Warthog is a much beloved aircraft used against ground troops and tanks in the Middle East. The Pentagon has started saying, we don't need this. It's going to be replaced by the F-35, Joint Strike Fighter. But there's a lot of resistance in the military to this. People coming on the news and saying we owe our lives to the A-10 Warthog because it is so effective against troops and tanks and so on. It can fly low and slow in a way far more effective against ground forces than these other super hot fighter bombers. It's like the F-35. The problem here is that the F-35 is not only the most expensive weapon system in the history of the world, it's still unflyable and unusable. It's 4 years at least behind in its scheduled deployment, and it's over budget, as those things always are. So the chairman of the House Services Committee, Mac Thornberry, has introduced legislation to forbid the Air Force from retiring the plane, that is the A-10. Thornberry's proposed law would prohibit the Air Force from using funds to retire the A-10 and would forbid the service from reducing manning levels for the aircraft. It would keep the A-10 in service until the results of a 2018 competition between the A-10 and the F-35A are complete, and so on. So there it is. Once again, we've remarked here before, Congress insists on continuing the production, for the example of the Abrams tank. The Pentagon has said repeatedly, over and over again, we don't need it, we don't want it, but the congressman from the area in Ohio where these things are being produced keeps saying there will be massive unemployment if we stop making these things. We don't really care whether they're actually ever used for anything. So the production of these tanks will continue, and they're accumulating in a big field on the eastern edge of California near the Nevada border, and there are hundreds upon hundreds of them there. There's no indication that they will ever be used for anything. That's all.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching Aware on the Air, and we are talking about the war making around the world that the United States government is carrying on, and war and preparations for war, and the general turning away from these facts by most of our media, so that most Americans are not aware that these things are going on. We'll turn away from the West for a moment and pivot to Asia. We've already had a fair amount to say about China this evening, but we'll go to Karen Aram for some more talk about Asia.
Well, first I want to comment on the F-35. Ron, I doubt that we will use them. I agree with you. But we've been pushing them onto our allies in Asia now. I think it was about a year ago. I think it was South Korea, if I'm not mistaken. We were pushing them to buy the F-35 from us. So I think we call that dumping. Anything that we don't want or don't want to use or can't use, we dump onto Southeast Asia. And I can attest to that, having lived there for many years. Something also I want to mention, you were referring to President Obama's trip to Hiroshima recently. I want to refer to Prime Minister Abe of Japan's trip that he's going to make to Sochi. I don't have the date on that, but this was against Obama's pressuring him not to go to Sochi to talk with Putin of Russia about the Kuril Islands. And the Kuril Islands, we've talked about them before, have been a have been a real issue between Russia and Japan. I think going back to World War II, if I'm not mistaken. As a result, they have never had an end of war agreement. So Abe going to talk to Russia now is signaling what I've been pretty much trying to promote here, is that throughout the U.S. allies that we, have to excuse my voice, that the U.S. has been doing everything we can to either pressure or appease or to buy or to influence, whatever means it takes to do that, even threaten, to utilize them and have them go against China. That at the end of the day, I do think that they're smarter than that. They know how to utilize us. And I think that on certain issues, yeah, they'll take our money, they'll buy our weapons, I have no doubt. We have better relations with the militaries of these governments because they don't have to be elected, as proven in Thailand. But I think I want to quote something here right now that I found today, and this was just a couple days ago, because I thought I better update myself on the Silk Railroad, which the high-speed railroad, which China has been building and attempting all the way to Europe, throughout Africa, throughout Asia. Specifically, I've spent a lot of time talking about the goal to avoid the Malacca Straits, as Carl mentioned, I think, briefly here. But this comes from Stratfor. Now, they position themselves as a private think tank, okay, out of Texas. But I've received information that they're actually an arm of the CIA. But there's nothing like reading government information to really get the lowdown on what's going to happen. And their article just, I think, 6 days ago, totally refutes what I had received from the WPR about the railroad. In January, there was talk, and this comes from a writer, a Thai writer, that finally Thailand had agreed again to go back with the contract and the agreement to have China build the railroad through Thailand, which is sort of an integral part. Thailand and Laos are very important to Southeast Asia and to China's rail, okay? They know they've lost Burma, they're having problems with Vietnam, and they're and problems with getting Cambodia to agree. But I thought, okay, so here we are back again with China. Well, then Stratfor comes up and says exactly the opposite 6 days ago, that again, Thailand has evidently gone against doing that, fulfilling that agreement. Instead, the military government there is now looking at Japan again. And Japan began, they were the creme de la creme of building the high-speed railway. I mean, we know they go back, the bullet train. And they built the first railroad, high-speed railroad in China, the Makliv, I believe they built that. But the Chinese came in and they improved upon it. Of course, the Germans have been building, they do the rail lines, but the Chinese then, they adopt the technology and then they start to improve upon it, and they can do it less expensive. But they're both competitors in this area, specifically with Thailand. So Stratford came up with their forecast on the railroad, and I thought this was worth mentioning. They have forecasted in the coming years, Southeast Asia will build up connectivity through projects that include high-speed rail as part of its broader integration goals. Well, we've been talking about that now for over 2 years. They will, lacking the capital to fund these efforts on its own, Southeast Asian nations will play China and Japan off each other to exact better contractual terms, which is what I've been saying that I think we're seeing in Thailand. That's what these governments will do. And despite China's growing competitiveness, Japan's rail industry will remain a key player in Southeast Asian projects. And that's because if this is an arm of the U.S. government, then this Stratford think tank, that's their goal, is to make sure that Japan gets to construct the rails. But on that topic, even though Thailand is wavering between who they're going to give the agreement to, they have said that they plan to use Chinese engineers and some of that. So that will be interesting to watch. Something else that, Ron, you were referring to related to Africa, and I want to bring this up, that just yesterday I read that, this is an article by Thomas Geist. He said that the U.S. Defense Department, he says, announces a deployment of troops into Yemen. Rather than the word announce, I'd like to use the word admitted. Basically, the U.S. military announced Friday, this was just this past Friday, that dozens of American, and they call them advisors, I think that's how we started under the Kennedy administration, when we infiltrated advisors into Vietnam, although it started before that during the Eisenhower years. I don't know what we were doing at that time, but we started with so-called advisors under Kennedy, and then the bombing came. Okay, these advisors have been deployed to Yemen over the past 2 weeks. They are working with Saudi and Arab coalition troops seeking to assert control over southern portions of the country, including the areas controlled by al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And the deployment of U.S. ground forces to Yemen comes amid a general escalation of U.S. war-making in the region, including the dispatch of 450 U.S. commandos, Apache helicopters and B-52 bombers, along with hundreds of additional U.S. Marines for operations in Iraq and Syria, where U.S. Air Forces have carried out more than 5,000 strikes since August 2014 as part of an air war that has expended more than $7 billion in Pentagon contingency funds. So, you know, this is troops on the ground, boots on the ground, people. I want to mention an article here on the 5th of May by Bill Van Auken. He refers to a U.S. change of command in Europe, which signals escalation of anti-Russia threats. And this new guy who is replacing General Philip Breedlove, his name is Scaparrotti, okay? Yeah, it's a long name. And I had read where Breedlove, heading up NATO, or it's not NATO, I'm sorry, it's what we call the U.S. European Command, or like EUCOM in Germany. But Scaparrotti, the U.S. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter, the two of them, it's General Curtis Scaparrotti, sorry, they both declared that the Pentagon had to prioritize deterrence against Russia and accused Moscow of nuclear saber rattling. I mean, really, all we can do is laugh if it wasn't so horrifically dangerous, and it's just so ridiculous. And Carter reiterated the Pentagon's plans to deploy an American armored brigade combat team near the Russian border on a rotational but persistently present basis. General Scaparrotti placed a resurgent Russia striving to project itself as a world power at the top of his list of threats confronting U.S. interest in Europe ahead of terrorism. I mean, it's so ridiculous. I posted something on Facebook that I received recently. I think it's from Andrew Corbio, but I'm not sure now. But it's on Moldova. Now, I had to look up Moldova because I honestly had no idea where it was. Ron, do you want to point to Moldova? Because it's important to know where it's located on the map and why I'm mentioning this.
Okay. Here is Ukraine,
Okay.
and
Romania.
then Moldova is right here on the northwest corner of the Black Sea,
Right.
next to Ukraine.
Right.
It's a relatively small place.
But it's also on the border of Romania because
Yes.
it was part of
Right.
Romania, and that's very important. That's very important. to
Yeah, a
know.
little northeast of Bucharest.
Right. Well, there's good news and bad news about Moldova. The good news is that they had their Victory Day celebration yesterday, was the 9th, right?
Right.
Throughout Russia, okay. And victory over Germany. And Moldovians also celebrated Victory Day. But when NATO tanks came in, actually NATO tanks with U.S. flags, because of course they're supported by the U.S., came into town, into Moldova, that I can't say the name of the what do you call the capital? Sorry, it's beyond my capabilities to say it. The people were furious. They literally chased them out of town, if you can believe that. But that's what I got somewhere. So they absolutely did not want U.S. flags on NATO tanks coming into their town while they were celebrating Russian Victory Day over Germany during World War II. Now, the bad news here is that Victoria Nuland is focused now on Moldova. And she's urging that it's premature for elections. They shouldn't have elections yet. I don't know what her reasoning is, but bottom line, when you see Victoria Nuland moving in on any place, just as she did in Kiev, it's time to worry. It's time to be fearful because it means that a color revolution is likely to come. So I'm making a prediction here, people. Keep your eye on Moldova. It could be very serious. Let me see, is there anything else I want to talk about? Oh, yeah, I think this is important to know, too. It's what we call the U.S.-China conflict and the political crisis in Latin America. I think last week I talked about Africa and Libya and how really important and disastrous it was that we destroyed Libya, because look at the war that it's brought about, the destruction, the deaths, for which I blame Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, but make no mistake, Obama as president was equally responsible, and he can't blame anyone else for it, okay? Because he's in charge. He's the one who rubber stamps these things. The reason Libya, as I point out at that time, was so important and is a relation to China, because there was so much China infrastructure projects going on. China lost billions over that. And that's one of the major reasons. There are a lot of reasons why we wanted to destroy Libya and remove Gaddafi, just as we want to destroy Syria and remove Assad. I mean, it's basically regime change. And the destruction is just kind of like, okay, that's all right, then we get to go and rebuild and control. Well, now we're looking at, but again, it's a lot has to do with China. Now we're looking at Latin America. Okay, we've been looking at Latin America, make no mistake, but this article is pretty comprehensive by Bill Van Auken, written on May 5th. He says the region of Latin America of nearly 630 million people is emerging as both an explosive arena of the class struggle and another battleground in the drive by U.S. imperialism to impose its global hegemony by means of escalating confrontations with both real and potential rivals. This region contemptuously is referred to by the U.S. as our own backyard. And trade between China now and Latin America has increased by some 2,000% over the past 15 years. And that's what we don't like. Plans have been unveiled to build a new Nicaraguan canal that would eclipse the Panama Canal and a transoceanic railway between Brazil and Peru. Chinese-funded projects aimed at redirecting the region's economies towards China. Pentagon strategists have warned that China's increasing economic ties to the region are undermining U.S. influence. I won't go on with that. I won't take up any more time on that. But here again, this is something that's really frightening when you consider the devastation that we have already brought to many of these nations. And already we're looking at Venezuela, we're looking at Argentina, we're looking at Brazil, we're looking at, well, we've already done to El Salvador. Now, I had talked about this Nicaraguan canal back a couple of months ago, and I didn't know what had happened to it. It had a private Chinese firm was funding it, and everything is there and set up, and then suddenly the owner, he disappeared. Nobody knows what happened, so I will have to look into that more. But it tells me that the plan is still there. It's still on the books. We know, I mean, this article doesn't even mention Honduras. It doesn't even mention what has happened, excuse me, to some of these other nations. So I'm thinking that, and Ecuador could be facing trouble. So again, I think we do need to look at Latin America and keep a close watch because we know things are going to happen there. And only one other comment I do want to make, Ron, is that when you refer to the New York Times as a liberal newspaper, in the 60s, my friends and I, in the 70s also, we all read the New York Times. We thought of it as liberal. Even if we couldn't afford it all the time, we made sure one of us got the Sunday newspaper and we devoured it. But today I would have to refer to it as the neoliberal arm of the U.S. government in so many respects because I've been reading so much. If we don't call it propaganda, yeah, it's really appalling.
Yeah, well, I apologize for the lapse. I ordinarily don't like to use the terms liberal, conservative, or left, right, or so on, because they muddle up things so much that they're kind of hopeless. But
No
anyway,
apology no apology necessary, but I had to make that point. So, okay, I think that's enough from me for now.
Thank you, Karen. Appreciate that. You're watching News from Neptune. You've both brought up a series of important things here that are worth comment. I wanted to start with Ron's comment about the rationale for war that Obama has carried on. We're in this peculiar situation where the Obama administration is carrying on war around the world, as I said, more intensely, more extensively than the Bush administration ever did. But in contrast to Bush's bluff honesty about his imperialism, Obama came into office on an anti-war platform and has tried to convince Americans that he's ending the wars and that indeed they shouldn't pay any attention to the ongoing wars because this was only the final phase and he was going to lead these wars from behind, so to speak, and not really take them very seriously at all. In fact, the result has been the production of the most extreme terrorist campaign in the world, as it has been called. That is his drone assassination campaign that's killed thousands of people, but has the virtue of not killing many Americans except those that are targeted by the drone assassination campaign. It's not like sending troops into countries, putting boots on the ground in the phrase. Now, as Karen pointed out, the Obama administration is busily putting boots on the ground, most notably this week, as Ron said, in Yemen. But the fact of the matter is that the authority, the legal authority for Obama to carry on this war, that he says he's not doing, is ambiguous in the extreme. As Ron pointed out, it's the 2001 authorization for the use of military force that remains the bedrock of the administration's right to kill people around the world in our name. There is a good investigation of the convoluted legal arguments in an article that appeared this week that I will put on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air, or rather the Aware Facebook page that in fact is labeled and I think just with the name aware of Champaign-Urbana. You can find the article there. What the article does, it's entitled "How the Obama's Lawyers Legalized," in quotes, "the War on Terror." It concludes that all three branches of government now have persuaded themselves, according, or at least told the media they have, that there are legal grounds for doing things, for killing people around the world, that a generation ago would have been judged clearly illegal and or unconstitutional by any disinterested court in the United States. Now, this is a major change, an important change. It'll be interesting to see what President Clinton 2.0 does with this sort of authorization, given what she's done so far. But the argument that Ron raises is an extremely important one, and you'd think it would be part of our political campaign. It's not, and that is unfortunate.
I have a question. Excuse me. How does that refer to MOU, something like that, the military authorization for war?
AUMF, the authorization.
Thank you.
The authorization for the use of military force.
Right, thank you. Well, I recall, maybe it was about 2 months ago, Carl, I recall you mentioning something about O'Connell rushing through the halls with an AUMF, like an updated or revised or a new one for President Obama.
That's right.
And is that what you're referring to, that is now available?
Well,
Have
it was
we heard
pointed out
anything more?
when Obama came into office and reversed his promise to end the war and sent 30,000 new troops to Afghanistan, that the point that Ron was making, that he was doing this on the basis of George Bush's authorization
Right.
to proceed against the people who did 9/11,
Right.
looked a little strange. That 2001 congressional declaration says, it's already not clear that that's the functional equivalent of a declaration of war, as I think Ron mentioned. What that said was that the president was authorized to use military force against the people who perpetrated the crimes of 9/11, 2001, and those associated with them. Well, of course,
Right.
that was the elastic phrase. The associations, now 15 years later, includes people in Nigeria and Pakistan.
Right.
And so the legal, I mean, it's a joke. It's a
Right.
joke that happens to be necessary. Remember, when the Nazis came to power in Germany, they've observed all the legal forms to put their regime in place. Now, the rest of the world looked at it and saw that it was a joke. But when the same things are done elsewhere, we don't recognize, we don't find it as quite so funny.
Well,
Add to the hilarity, Obama has said repeatedly he would like an updated and more precise version
Exactly.
of this
Well, he's
thing,
got it now.
but he doesn't really need it.
Yeah, he doesn't need
that's
it.
right.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
My point is that I think there is a revised version because, Carl, you referred to it, I think.
It's been
probably December.
introduced and it's not been passed.
Oh,
That's
okay,
not a-
that was my question. It's
Yeah.
been introduced but not passed. Now, I want to point something else out, is that in Yemen, one of the, in the south, where we have sent troops again, or sent troops into to support our allies who've been fighting this as proxies, that area is controlled by Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda was responsible for 9/11. So I'm wondering if they're going to use that as their excuse. But as you point out, Pakistan, Nigeria, Libya, all of Syria, this has gotten ridiculous. I look at what we did to the Pentagon, what the Pentagon did to the rules of engagement. Literally, that was last year, April 2015. Literally rewriting, they had the Pentagon lawyers do it, rewriting the rules of engagement, okay? That pretty much opened the door to excusing anything and everything, and that would include drone warfare, I fear. Although there is something going on now in the UK where they're now contemplating and debating the use of drones to kill people because it's not due process of law. We've had minor discussions on that issue. One was right here at our university here, law school, but still it's not open to what we call public discussion. And at the end of the day, I think that you're quite right. It doesn't matter because our government will rewrite everything and anything just to suit their needs and to ensure that they're not legally held responsible or that they can't be prosecuted for the war crimes that they've committed. So
The
that's-
USA has never explicitly acknowledged that they're using drones, right? It's still technically a secret, although everyone
That's-
knows about it.
That's absolutely right. That's correct.
Well,
Although when
yes, Obama did. He did acknowledge it.
but the point was that the use of the drone campaign as used by the Obama administration to counter those who say, well, as in the last presidential election, Obama isn't serious about fighting terrorism. Yes, we are, says the Obama administration. Let's tell. If we could only tell you about the secret drone program, you could see how serious we are. And so the way they do it is to leak an account to the New York Times for just the reasons you suggested earlier about the New York Times. And the New York Times publishes a puff piece about how Obama is advised by his personal priest, they even use that term, John Brennan, head of the CIA, on the moral use of drones, i.e. drones only to kill bad guys. Now the problem is that those drones are inaccurate. The bad guys that John Brennan recommends to Obama to kill with drones, he brings him apparently baseball cards with the bad guys' names on them, and Obama picks out the ones that they want to kill with drones. The problem is that 90% of the people who are killed by the drones are not the bad guys,
Right.
but people in the vicinity.
Civilians. Right.
And that produces, obviously, many more terrorists as a result, but the U.S. is locked into a strategy here that wants to avoid American casualties and continue the killing around the world with a remarkable degree of aplomb. There is an extremely good book about this by one of the remarkable Coburn brothers,
Andrew.
who's been writing about politics. The three of them have been writing about politics on these matters for years. Andrew Coburn, whose book Kill Chain describes the modern system of making war via drones and the unmanned, a wonderful pun, aircraft that the Obama administration uses. Now, I mention Andrew Coburn particularly because I want to recommend an article by him. I'll post this too to the AWARE website, to the AWARE Facebook page, that appeared in the January Harper's magazine, in which he describes the relationship between the Obama administration and Al-Qaeda. Back to the point that you all were making about the fact that the U.S. could claim that a lot of the killing it's been doing in the Obama administration was authorized by the 2001 congressional resolution for going after Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda actually still existed, and indeed there were people associated with it. Yes, there are people associated with it, and the associates are often the CIA.
Right,
The remarkable
right.
thing is that the CIA, for example, the real scandal of the Benghazi affair, which the Republicans have wanted to use against Mrs. Clinton, is the fact that Benghazi was used as one of the principal channels for sending arms to the people the U.S. was supporting in Syria against the Syrian government. Who were these people? They were Al-Qaeda. This is what Coburn's article sets out in detail, and he puts it in the context of American policy going back 40 years of how the U.S. has encouraged Al-Qaeda and groups like it for its own purposes, first of all, to annoy the Russians in Afghanistan before the Russians invaded Afghanistan. Now, the connection between the United States war-making and the use of terrorism extends, according to a lot of people, to the origins of ISIS. The use of jihadism, the use of takfiris, the Salafists, the Islamic radicals, has been a staple of American policy back to the Carter administration, and the Obama administration has fallen in perfectly happily with that. Amazingly enough, the only major party candidate who has criticized it is Donald Trump. So we're in a never-never land of a wilderness of mirrors, has been suggested somewhere, about who's fighting whom and why. And the examples that you all have mentioned this evening seem to me to be particularly important in this regard.
How are we going to use Al-Qaeda as an excuse against China and against Russia, Ukraine?
Well,
That'll be a good one.
Well, the answer there is in Xinjiang. The Uyghurs, have connections with Al Qaeda.
But the U.S., I'm sorry, China can manage their own affairs in Xinjiang. The U.S. using that as a pretext for our nuclear weapons in the South China Sea just isn't going to cut it. I'm sorry. But you're right. If they could, they would.
Yeah, the connection here, of course, is the long-term American policy, and by long-term I mean really a century, of making sure that we have some, going back to the open door policy of the late 19th century, that the U.S. has effective control of the Asian economy.
Yeah.
I mean, that was noted even by scholars and others as long ago as the beginning of the 20th century, how crucial that was to American capitalists, really, and that remains true at the beginning of the 21st century. Some things don't change, and one of those things is the willingness of the United States to kill around the world in pursuit of the profits of the 1%, and that includes East Asia as well as Europe.
Yeah, there are revivals of the old spheres of influence idea when it's opportune, and yet denouncing anything that Russia or China might do with such a notion. So.
You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group in the 19th week of 2016. Another week in which the Obama administration's drone assassination program, the most extensive global terrorism campaign the world has yet seen, is paralleled by overwhelming police killings in the U.S., far beyond what happens in other countries. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for Aware for some of the articles that we've referred to tonight and notes about upcoming events.
We'll be at the Farmers Market Saturday morning in Urbana.
There's one. There's an upcoming event right there.
Right.
Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and the rest, who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zook, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael Bay, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.